watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a late Sunday night here doing a show. I'm going to bring him on here in just a moment. Vocab Malone, going to be talking about Black Hebrew Israelites and Black Hebrew Israelism, I guess is the proper way to say it. I guess he'll correct me when I bring him on here in just a moment. We're going to find out what exactly are Hebrew Israelites and, what should we know as Catholics or Orthodox or Protestants who are watching the show. Vocab Malone was born and raised on the south side of Columbus, Ohio. He holds a master's degree from Phoenix Seminary and is a doctoral student at Talbot School of Theology. Vocab's ministry focuses in urban apologetics and cultural worldview analysis. Vocab has done a number of debates and dialogues with Muslims, atheists, and Hebrew Israelites. Once again, we're going to be talking about that topic, bringing Vocab Malone on coming up next. Vocab Malone, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, glad to be here. Michael, I always like talking to you ever since I got to know you. And actually, one of my supporters recommended you. So that's how I stumbled across you.
You know what? I've heard about you for a while. In fact, I remember watching a show or something that you did years ago with Dr. James White on his channel. And then I also checked out your channel. It's on YouTube. Anybody who's not familiar with it, type in Vocab Malone, Street Apologist Live. Go subscribe. You'll find it right away. And then also, in fact, I did a show with you, I want to say about 3 weeks ago, where we were talking about Eastern Orthodoxy. If y'all want to check that out, again, go to the channel. But yeah, I've heard of your content for a while. I knew you did stuff with Black Hebrew Israelites. So I really look forward to this. Maybe before we dive into that topic specifically, though, just kind of tell me about yourself, your experience as a Christian. Were you always a Christian? Stuff like that.
Yeah, I was blessed to be raised in a household where my parents were Christians. They were both Protestants. One had a background of being a Southern Baptist, and the other had a background of primarily Methodism, and so I kind of saw those circles, as well as maybe non-extremist variety of charismatic element of evangelicalism. So not like hyper-Pentecostalism or anything like that. I mean, sometimes I'll run into that, but kind of more balanced folks. Some people think there's no such thing as a balanced charismatic, but I believe there is from my background experience. And I moved from Columbus, Ohio to Phoenix, Arizona to go to a Assemblies of God Bible College, mainly for pastoral training. And while I was there, I believe I grew and not only learned how to serve people. We had to do almost 800 hours of hands-on internship over 2 years. I think it was like 700 some, but it might have been 780. I forget the exact number. So extensive hands-on stuff that you had to do, from wheelchair ministry to media ministry to cleaning to, long list. But and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go there. But also in basic systematic theology, basic hermeneutic skills, and I really appreciated that. I probably left less charismatic. Maybe I went in as a Pentecostal and left as a charismatic, if that makes sense to people listening. But eventually I ended up in Phoenix Seminary, and I never thought I'd be there. It's seminary. I just never thought that was going to be my life. But I was glad to be there. And it was not a reform school. There's some reform professors now, so someone may think, oh, Wayne Grudem's there, this is a Calvinist school. It was not at all at that time. Grudem was there though, but it was sort of in the middle of Phoenix Seminary where I realized I was kind of becoming reformed. And it wasn't because of my professors though, because they were almost all the opposite. And it wasn't because of the classmates, because usually there'd be like one Calvinist in each class, But over time it happened, and mainly my understanding of it would be constant exposure to the text bumping up against things I assumed were right. You know, I get sort of Protestant traditional soteriology within an Arminian spectrum. And I try to fight it because I only had bad experiences with Reformed folks. And to be frank, I only heard bad things about them. So the limited ones I knew were horrible. And then I heard bad things. So I was like, let's stay away from that. But eventually, my understanding would be the text of Scripture acted as a anchor that really pulled me and kind of had me sit there, and reading Norm Geisler didn't fix it, basically.
Right.
So then when I kind of realized this, oh boy, you know, I had a couple friends call me and try to do an intervention. I wasn't rabid or anything. It was just like
intervention because you were going Calvinist.
Yeah, because I was going Reformed, and I wasn't rabid. I was never a cage
You were
stager.
cage staged. Okay.
No, I was never like that. What it was is any hint that you were leaning in that direction, a bunch of people in my life, that would be a major problem. Like one of my buddies wrote a book about how Calvinism is essentially a cultic religion, right? And this is one of my buddies. So clearly people are concerned, even though I was never rabid. Right. I was always pretty chill and kind of undercover in a way. Like I was just like, one day one person said, "You kind of sound like a Calvinist." I was like, crap, do I? Sorry. But you know, it's funny. Last thing I'll say about that, because I know that's not why I'm on here. It just happened. One of the final straws was reading some Augustine. Yeah. And it wasn't that I had this view of, it wasn't like I was leaving sola scriptura, but it was more the way he explained certain things about divine sovereignty and human responsibility that really resonated. It was the way he explained it. I felt was practical and helpful and pastoral. And I said, yeah, that is what I've been wrestling through. That makes sense. Now it's so infuriating because I cannot find that section. I don't know this is like 15 years ago or so, maybe not quite that long, but this is a while ago. I was trying to go back and find that exact spot because I remember I was standing up reading. It was one of the times I was standing up reading and I was like, put it down. I was like, whoa, you know, I'm not saying Augustine was a, you know, Calvinist in North Africa. I am not being anachronistic in that way. I understand that there's all kinds of things he did that I wouldn't do and vice versa. I'm not, but it was this section and it was one of the final straws. So his interesting little journey, but really my heart the whole time, Michael, has been evangelism and having fruitful conversations with people and also having a little fun doing it. So that's why sometimes you'll see me be very friendly and nice, but then you'll also see a video where I'm being very sardonic or sarcastic or maybe doing satire. Because to me, you can do both, but some people don't think you can. I get it. Those kinds of videos mainly deal with Islam, the ones I'm talking about there. But my passion for evangelism was what eventually drove me into the arms of Hebrew Israelism. Because I saw these guys on the street all over and I didn't feel like they're being dealt with. Then I would go online, hardly any resources. Next thing I know, it's like God's opening these doors and I'm falling into holes. And I'm like, I better do this as long as I can for as many people as I can until I don't need to anymore. And Hebrew Israelism is an important thing that I'm regularly looking at. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to do a live stream where I celebrate its 129th birthday, which they're not going to like because they're going to say it's older than that. But basically the idea can be traced back to a certain day. And I'm going to celebrate the 129th birthday tomorrow and talk about the history of this idea.
I didn't even think it was that old.
Yeah, no, it is. It is
Wow,
the first documented case, William Crowdy. He was in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And he had a plot out there. He was like a farmer. And apparently he was working on his own field. And he got this vision. And then it sounds a little bit Joseph Smithy to me, to be frank with you. But the revelation is not about tablets or something. It's you all are the true Israelites. And he didn't seem to be a mean guy. He had actually a multicultural following. So he wasn't one of these guys who said you have to be an Israelite because now he thought it was to enjoy heaven or something like that. But he did get arrested because he still had this disruptive message. He did get arrested, but I don't think my understanding of his arrests wasn't like he was really doing anything bad. but he created some problems when he would do the street preaching and stuff.
Mm.
But there was another guy shortly after him, F.S. Cherry, who had the same vision, and his was explicitly racist. So right there in the 1890s, you see from the two kind of people that we first know about hearing about Hebrew Israelism, you kind of see the two strands, sort of this multicultural, little friendlier side that's still an ethnocentric message, and to be frank with you, based upon a mistake. And then on the other side, a much more militant version that makes radical prophecies a lot more centered on the leader. And that's the way F.S. Cherry was versus Crowdy. So they're almost like the two pictures of Hebrew Israelism, even though most Hebrew Israelites don't know who those guys are. I kind of just see right there, though, in the 1890s, you see this guy is kind of the model of these folks, and this guy is a model of those folks. So that's a little bit about the history anyway.
I had no idea it was even that old, although it's not old at all. But
Right.
you know, my only experience with Black Hebrew Israelites was when I lived in New York. I came across a few, and they seemed extremely racist. But other than that, I don't know a whole lot about it. Again, I've seen a couple shows, but you know, I can't tell you who the leading figures are, what their main doctrinal
Right.
you know, concerns are. So maybe if you can kind of introduce us to that.
Well, yes, I can. You know, you said New York. Do you remember where you were in New York?
Staten Island.
You were in Staten Island, where all my people
Yeah.
hang out. That's where all the Italians moved, I heard.
Right. Yeah. All the Italians.
Yeah, moved out of Bensonhurst and took up residence in Staten Island. Well, New York is the epicenter of any discussion about the history of Hebrew Israelism. And you can't, if you're going to go deep dive, you can't neglect talking about Chicago and the South as people kind of get transplanted to the Northeast and the Midwest. But really, it's important to know the Commandment Keepers congregation in Harlem. Now, they essentially aren't really a congregation anymore, but there they were in 1919, established this congregation that said, hey, we are Israelites. And if you can tell by the name, obviously an emphasis on so-called law keeping, the Commandment Keepers, right? And they had an interesting relationship with the Jewish community, because at that time in Harlem, there was a lot more intermixture with all the changes in the demographics. And so Black folks and Jewish folks were kind of side by side at a lot of parts in Harlem. And they had an interesting relationship with the kind of mainstream Jewish community that wasn't always hostile, but could be kind of like everyone's unsure about each other. Well, fast forward 50 years. There's a couple other different groups. It's not like they're the only ones, you know, because I've talked about 1896 with Crowdy. Now we're talking about 1919. Well, when you go to 1969, then you have the establishment of a group of Hebrew Israelites who left the Commandment Keepers. They felt that it didn't have enough New Testament in it, apparently, and started at 1 West 125th Street. So if you get my book, it says an introduction to the history and doctrine of 1 West Hebrew Israelism. Yeah. 1 West is a certain umbrella. It's not the name of a group per se. It's an address. And then the ideas that are similar to the school that was at 1 West, now we call 1 West Hebrew Israelism, as to distinguish it from, say, the Chicago variety, Israel of God, who would say, if you're a Gentile, you can be grafted in. The 1 Westers say, if you're a Gentile, according to my standards, you'll be my slave in the kingdom. So that's one of the big differences, right? And when you go now, what happened? Well, the internet happened. Like for a lot of groups, it was bad for the Mormons, but good for the Hebrew Israelites, right? And so what happened with the Hebrew Israelites is they started putting their videos on YouTube. And people were inspired by this street preaching stuff. They were inspired by these public access TV shows being uploaded to the channel, because they're like, what is this? I'm an Israelite. And it's not just Black folks, according to 1 West Hebrew Israelism. It's Hispanic, it's Native American. So you got all these folks, they're Israelites, these other people are the other now. Let's go spread this message to awaken our people in the last days, because that's what will essentially hasten the day of the Lord, when Yahushai, as the 1 Westers call him, or depends on what the group is, but Yahushai is one of the names that they'll call Jesus, comes back and establishes a kingdom with Israel at charge, where everything now will be reversed and they'll have their own servants as opposed to be servants.
When you say they'll have slaves in the king, are they saying they're going to have white people who are slaves to them?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Now.
Oh yeah.
Are
not
there
just white
any?
folks, not just white folks, Africans too.
Okay, so I'm confused.
They don't think they're African.
Okay. Okay. All right. I got you then.
Uh-huh.
Are there any white people who are currently enslaved to the? I'm sure there's not actual slaves, but I'm just saying, are there any white people who are brainwashed enough to actually think that they're serving them right now? I'm just curious.
If you go,
is this
on
just
YouTube,
something in the eschaton?
Put Hebrew Israelites and put boot kissing.
Okay.
Right, you're gonna have a lot of fun.
Okay.
Now, if you do that, what you'll see are a number of people, not always white, but usually white.
Okay.
Not always crazy, but sometimes crazy. Sometimes they look like normal people.
Right.
And they will bow down and lick the shoes of these Hebrew Israelites when they're out on the street. Right.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is how they get there. They usually don't get there by utilizing the passages that they claim are relevant to it. Passages they claim are relevant to it are what some Old Testament scholars will sometimes call the submission motif. These are passages that speak about Israel's empowerment over their enemies and them being vanquished and distraught and brought low and now in submission to Israel in some way, right? And so there's some passages like that. And a book like Isaiah is interesting because it'll seem to have those. And then it'll have also these passages that talk about a kingdom with massive Gentile inclusion. Very fascinating. This is kind of deep biblical theology stuff. Well, these Hebrewites will go to these passages and they'll kind of point to the person kissing their boot, whatever it is, licking it. They sometimes literally lick it. And they'll read it. But the way they usually get them there is basically to say, now, if you feel bad for what your people did to our people, show how sorry you are and kiss my boot, right? And they'll usually start with one. And it's like, once you got one, you got to do them all. And so they'll all line up with their feet real quick, right? Their shoes, and have them do it. And I asked him about this practice, right? Because I'd say you have this liturgical practice that you do that's not justified in the scriptures. And so I've been trying to get one of them to debate me on this. Now, not all groups do this. GMS does it. They're not as frequent on. I would say they used to do it. Sakari loves to do it. A group called Watchmen for Israel loves to do it. The ISUPK loves to do it. GOCC doesn't do it. IUIC has gotten away from it a little bit. So different groups like this practice, right? But this liturgical practice. So they really can't justify it because where's that in the Bible, right? And what's funny is they'll practice.
Are they sola scriptura?
No. Now, they'll say, if it's not in this book, I don't care. They'll say something like that to you a lot of times. Okay. But then you find out, well, they also believe that, Ariah, his dream and vision of an angel who gave them the 12 tribes chart is legitimate and authoritative. Or that the special Hebrew they speak called Lashawan Kodash, which eliminates the vowel sounds and just supplies them with an ah sound with a few exceptions. So Yahweh, Yahweh Shai, Kwam Yasharala means rise Israel, that kind of stuff. They have that plus most Hebrew Israelites hold to the Apocrypha as authoritative and canonical. But when they get over to Paul, it's a mess. These groups don't know what to do with Paul. They don't know what to do with him. As you could imagine, it would be problematic for a lot of their theology.
But they hold to part of the New Testament?
So it depends on which group you're talking about, right? Okay. So let's say I mentioned Sakari. Sakari, when they're talking to an unsuspecting Christian, will act as if they believe Paul's writings, and they'll try to use them against a Christian. But when you pin them down on something Paul said, they'll say, I don't consider Paul part of the Bible anyway. And then you start to look and you realize they consider the Gospels to have errors. Okay. And then you look and like, well, what do you believe in the New Testament? This is for Sakari. Another guy named Ron Shields, aka Divine Prospect. He leads some ministry in Atlanta, Georgia called Kingdom Harbingers. He says, I believe Gentiles can be saved, but Paul's writings are rabbinical opinions for Gentile converts. Therefore, they're totally irrelevant to me. So that's what he says about Paul's writings. And then if you approach him with, say, Matthew 28, 19 through 20, the passage that speaks of the Trinity in the context of the Great Commission, he'll say, well, I believe that was added later. And then you say, but there's no manuscript evidence that this is not a textual critical issue. And baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is in every manuscript that contains that passage in Matthew 28. It's you can't find it missing, basically. And so it's this whole discussion. So they'll like say, well, this was added, right? Some oneness do that as well. They'll just say, well, that was added later. All right. Well, show me the manuscript where it's at. This isn't 1 John 5:7, right? This is a different situation with Matthew 20. And then you'll go to another Hebrews-like group, and they'll say, okay, well, first let's look at what Peter says about Paul. Peter says that people who are unstable twist Paul. So you guys are twisting Paul. So let me give you the real understanding of Paul, who was an Israelite like me. You're not an Israelite, so you can't understand him. So some will take that track. They'll say they claim to him, but then they literally will turn on his head what he says. Like you'll say, look, Paul says circumcision availeth nothing. So it doesn't count for works here. You see this? Circumcision availeth nothing. And then, 5 minutes later, they'll say, hey, you have to be circumcised to be keeping the law. I'm not against circumcision. The point is their view of the law and how they interpret Paul. Because a lot of them, brother, they don't even think they're in the new covenant. They'll say Jesus came to renew the old covenant, so we're in a renewed covenant. Or they'll say we're not in the new covenant until everything is fully established. So they don't even think we're in a new covenant. Despite, you bring up Luke and say, well, sounds like we are in the new covenant. So there's that. So it depends on the group that you're talking to. They like to accuse Christians of running to Paul. That's a common thing that they'll say, was running to Paul. So practical tip, right? If you're going to deal with the Hebrew Israelites, like let's say you feel called to it even, or let's say you got a family member, feel called to it, but you care about this family member. So there you are, right? You should say, dear Lord, let me become wiser and let me do the diligence to see how the Old and New Testaments relate. Where's continuity? Where's discontinuity? What can I learn from how New Testament authors interpret Old Testament passages? What can I learn about when the New Testament writers quote or allude to Old Testament passage? What will that? And you just do this deep dive and understanding the Old Testament better in relationship to the New and the proper relationship. And it's not like, you can complete it. This is something that Christians study, but a lot of us are probably weak on it. And I like dealing with Hebrew Israelites because honestly, it helps me in my Bible study. It helps me understand my Old Testament better. But that's one thing I would say, be ready, because they'll go to Obadiah and they'll read you a passage and they'll say it's about the destruction of the white man in America. And if you're not somewhat familiar with what's going on in Obadiah, you don't really have a counter. You'll probably know that doesn't sound right. You probably know that, but you don't have a counter. You don't, or if they go to Revelation chapter 1 and say, look, this proves Jesus was a black man. Right. Without some good understanding of the Old Testament background to Revelation 1 and the way that Jesus being betrayed, or did I just say betrayed? That's Judas stuff. Portrayed, if you don't understand that, then it will be difficult for you. It'll be difficult for you because you want to give a biblical answer, not just say, oh, you're crazy, I don't have to listen. And so it can be more challenging than it sounds. A lot of people, Michael, when they hear about Hebrew Israelites, they think, oh, this is no big deal. They're growing and they're zealous, so watch out.
Well, that's kind of related to what I was going to ask next. You mentioned you were discussing textual criticism with some of them. To be honest, the few that I have seen speak, they sounded extremely ignorant when it comes to scripture, textual studies, things like that. Now, again, I don't know nearly as much about Black Hebrew Israelites as you do, but in your experience, are they really on par to where they could have those discussions?
So most Hebrew Israelites you run into are some version of KJV only, although as the religion grows, it's getting variegated. The answer to your question, without being too rude to them, basically is no. Most are not equipped with the proper background information to have any real textual critical discussion. They might share some things about, look at all these verses that were taken out of the KJV, right?
The KJV, which was, of course, translated by a whole bunch of white people.
Well, according to one Westers, King James was a black man.
And what's their evidence for this? I think it was like some picture that one guy found online or something.
His family name was Stewart, and Stewart can mean black, for example. They'll also show a picture. Actually, it's funny. Netflix put out a movie called Barry.
Okay,
I think 2016, and it was a movie about young Obama at Columbia, right?
Okay.
And so if you look at the basic layout, to cut over to Columbia from where we know Obama lived, he would have had to go through a gauntlet of Hebrew Israelites on a regular basis. And interestingly enough, in this movie, there's a scene where the young Obama actor has a brief interaction with the Hebrew Israelites, right, on 125th Street. Now, that's why my book is called Barack Obama versus the Black Hebrew Israelites. It doesn't have anything to do with Obama. I just wanted to, it's a title, right? It's a window into something. My point is, in this, whoever wrote the script has ran into Hebrew Israelites before, because they go through this thing and the guy says, well, according to the King James Version of the Bible, Jesus called white women a B, so I can call white women a B. Remember where Jesus says, the dogs, the scraps and all that? Remember that discussion with the Syro-Phoenician woman?
Right.
So
he thinks that's in reference to white women?
Yeah, he thinks they think that's a white woman, a non-Israelite. And since Jesus calls her a dog and she's a female, Jesus is calling the woman a B.
Oh.
You see what I'm saying?
Interesting.
So Jesus called white women bitches. I mean, I'm sorry if that's, I'm just being, so your audience can understand. I don't know if you need to cut that
female
out.
Dogs, the term for female dogs. Right.
Yeah. So,
wow.
But so then the Obama character has a decent comeback, which he goes, well, wasn't the King James written by, he basically says, wasn't King James a white man? And then the camera pans over and the Hebrew Israelite points to a board. And on the board has a picture of King James. He says, that's King James right there. Now, if you ask me, he looks like Billy D. Williams, who's the actor who played Lando Calrissian in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and all that. And so he's saying, look, he looks like it. And so they take these compressed images, the dimensions are wrong, and photocopies and all this kind of stuff. And they'll say this is King James. And part of the reason is some Hebrew Israelites have this alternate view of history that includes a Black Israelite aristocracy ruling over Europe during the Dark Ages, and that's why it's called the Dark Ages.
But by the way, just side note there with the Lando Calrissian, I think is how you say it, the Star Wars. There's actually a historical pope named Pope Lando. Oh. And what's funny is there's a book that you can read about the different popes and everything, and they'll show you pictures of all of them. Most of them are sketches for some of the older ones, right? But evidently the editor of this book did not know any better, because somebody created a picture of Lando Calrissian or whatever, dressed up as a pope. And in the book for Pope Lando's image, they actually used him. So as soon as you mentioned that, that's what I thought of.
I totally want to get this book.
I have to send you a snapshot of it.
That's like the Billy Ripken famous words on the bottom of the Bat Fleer 91 card, if anyone knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's epic.
I guess in your experience, don't they realize how ridiculous this comes across? Or do they honestly think that this is something that we're taking seriously?
Well, if I was going to play the role of a Hebrew Israelite, I might say, you want to know what's ridiculous? That's ridiculous that Jesus was a white man with blue eyes.
But who claims that? Who actually says that? I mean, genuinely.
They'll say, look at this picture right here.
But I've also seen, just kind of to push back on those who would say that. I've also seen Asian Jesuses, Black Jesuses, and other versions of Jesus. And I don't have a problem with them since, of course, he became incarnate. He heals all of humanity. So I really don't care how you depict them as long as he's a male. And that's the way I understand it. Whenever white Europeans are depicting him in that way, they're doing so in the same way that an Asian would depict Jesus as an Asian, when we all know he was an Asian.
It's funny you mentioned some of that. I have had some interesting discussion. Now, I'm the Protestant outsider in this, so I'm not acting like I'm the expert, but I've had some interesting discussions with Hebrew Israelites, specifically about Black Madonnas, partially for this reason. Right. And it's interesting because, like, if they'll say, well, there were images of a Black Jesus and they were destroyed, say, by the Roman Catholic Church. Sometimes I'll say something like that. I'll say, then how do you explain all the Black Madonnas they kept around? You know what I'm saying? So I guess I'm defending Rome at this point in some way.
That's absurd, as if there was this conspiracy of us destroying all those images. Again, I don't have a problem with somebody depicting Jesus as a Black man or an Asian man or a white European man, because again, he heals humanity in the incarnation. So really, I'm fine with whatever culture a person is from. identifying Jesus as part of their culture, as long as they understand historically Jesus was a Jew. As long as they understand that, I really don't care liturgically if you depict him in one way or another, since he heals all of humanity whenever he becomes incarnate. He takes on the Black ethnicity. He takes on the Asian ethnicity. He takes on all of those things, not historically, but healing them as a Jewish man.
Yeah, they might say, this would be a time they might want to quote Paul, Michael. They might say, because this is something they do say. Well, 2 Corinthians 11:4 says, if anyone comes and proclaims another Jesus other than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you received, you put up with it readily enough. And obviously they understand Paul saying there that you shouldn't. So they'll say, that's another Jesus. And a lot of times they'll say, look at this Jesus. He's European. That was the slave masters. And he has an effeminate spirit, because he's modeled after Caesar Borgia, which in Italian we like to say Cesare Borgia. So
they're equivocating what Paul is talking about to somehow talk about the way you depict Jesus visually. The way I understand Paul, he's talking about another Jesus as far as another message, not how you depict them. Paul's not thinking about depicting Jesus.
This will be a time we would agree on our understanding of Paul. I do believe that's what he's saying, because it's not the discussion of, well, the icon was wrong or something like that, right?
Yeah, the discussion was circumcision and imposing the Judaizer heresy on Christians.
So Hebrew Israelite might go further with you, and they might have one or two responses at that point. One is sort of a cop-out response I alluded to earlier that says, this isn't your book, so you can't properly interpret it anyway. We've let the Gentiles interpret it for far too long, and that's why we have these white Jesuses that our people have been worshiping. And they might say something like that. And
with that, if you were to say, but wait, where were you, I don't know, 1,600 years ago? Were you actually, your group, were y'all going around actually, transcribing these manuscripts and passing them on from one generation to another?
Yes, was that something? Were.
Okay, so they have any kind of historical evidence for these claims? Or?
So, with a lot of Hebrew Israelites, I'm trying not to be. There is a massive gap in kind of even a basic knowledge about church history, and I understand we all could be better. And I'm not trying to, there's a lot there to learn, right? But there's a massive gap. And so some of the arguments are pretty bad. Now, I'd hate to use a TikTok example, but let me use a TikTok example. There's a number of Hebrews like TikTok accounts. And some of the accounts I'm thinking of, one of the main things they'll do is play some music and show a bunch of images at once that are purported to be medieval paintings. And they'll zoom in or focus on anyone who either was black or not, Euro or something like that, or with the power of suggestion perhaps could be interpreted as a certain ethnicity, right? And they'll talk about, we were always here, da-da-da-da-da-da. And it's fascinating. I did a show where I called it Responding to TikTok Hebrew Israelites or something like that. And I went over some of these videos, and I didn't look at every single art painting because I couldn't track some down, but I looked at some, and it was a fascinating thing. Sometimes they would be like, look at this image of da-da-da. And it would be something else entirely. The dates would be wrong. All these kinds of claims didn't line up. And there's a lot of problems with the images they were using, but some of them would say, look at these paintings. We're right here. In fact, some of them like to get, there's a BBC clip you can watch. I think it's from the 90s. And I think Louis Theroux is his name, if I'm not mistaken. And he goes in and talks to some of the guys at 1 West, 125th at that time, or maybe it was at Madison. I forget which address at the time. But anyways, he goes in there and they pull out these books like Jewish Life in the medieval times. And they'll point to anyone in the picture that they'll say, well, look, this is supposed to be a book about Jewish life, but this guy looks black to me. He doesn't look black to you. And so their sense is we are there. And if they get into church history at all, they'll just say, these guys, they'll claim some of them for their own. So they do believe they were there. Or there are argumentations that deal with God's sovereignty in a loose way that have to do with God using Gentile sinners to preserve his word at times while we were out of power and in captivity. And now is the time where, as we're reawakening, we're sort of taking our book back. That's a common motif that you'll find from Gathering of Christ Church. I've heard them talk about that, for example, times. So some of the Hebrewites do accept, let's say, King James as being white, but they see this as God's sovereignty of essentially using the wicked for his purposes ultimately. So there's different responses they might give.
Now, from what it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like they're really preoccupied with dark skin. Why? Because just as a white person, I don't go around looking for historical depictions of Christians throughout the ages, and I don't go looking for which one of them were light skin, and let me try to use this somehow to substantiate a point. I really could care less what color skin
they might say. Well, you don't need to. I mean, they'll say, watch the 10 Commandments. Look how everyone's portrayed. I mean, you think Moses looked like Charlton Heston, and the Pharaoh or whoever looked like Yul Brynner, and they'll say you don't need to. It's all these portrayals and images are all over Hollywood. You guys love to make I don't know if you saw that movie, The Gods of Egypt.
Yes, I saw it.
And that was actually a controversy within secular media too. Like, hey, where are all these guys? Why are they mainly portrayed by actors of European descent? These are supposed to be the Egyptian gods, right? They'll point to stuff like that, for example, and say, that's all there. That's all you guys do is supplant. You want to be everyone. You want to be everywhere. But what does the book say? Read Revelation 1. Mm-hmm. His hair was white like wool. Now, who's the only person who has woolly hair on this planet?
Yeah, but then he has a sword coming out of his mouth and all kinds of other things that doesn't meet anybody's description.
Right. So we point that out to them. Now, even the passage says white hair white like wool. It's talking about color, not texture.
But I mean, there's a whole bunch of Middle Easterns who have pretty dark skin. I mean, I used to live in Israel, and you come across it all the time, and they're definitely not African. So maybe it could be referring to somebody like that, even though I don't believe that Revelation 1 is in reference to some kind of historical
symbolic portrayal of Jesus,
right. But let's say just somehow that if this were a historical representation, which I don't believe Revelation 1 is about, couldn't it be, a Middle Eastern who has dark skin? What would they say to something like that?
They'll say the white man made up the term Middle Eastern. It's a modern term, so you shouldn't use that. Really, if you study, you'll find out that Israel sits on the same tectonic plate as part of the continent of Africa. So really, Israel is part of Africa.
Well, whatever you want to call it, the people that I used to live with, when you go over there, they don't look African, but they have really dark skin. Those people, whatever you want to call them, couldn't maybe the book of Revelation refer to them?
Well, it's not just about dark skin. It's about lineage.
Okay.
So if you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, the Ishmaelites, they would be referring to Arabs at that point. They have dark skin, but they're not us. They're not our people. They're not on the 12 tribes chart. This is if you're talking to a one Wester. But non-one Westers also do not think Arab peoples are able to be of the elect. Now, they would say they can be grafted in as Gentiles, but they don't think that. But also the same thing goes with Indians, from the continent, from India itself.
Yeah.
But they'll say something. So it's not just about that. Then some of the Hebrew Israelites, Michael, like GMS I mentioned earlier, Great Millstone Israelites, they actually say it's not about color so much so that you in 2021 could look like a so-called Edomite, but be descended from Israel all the way down on your father's side and actually be an Israelite. And they go to some passages in the Old Testament. One says Israel's like a speckled bird, and they'll say this is showing that Israel will have mixed complexions. And another one says
Edomite, that's a white person?
Edomite, under most Hebrew Israelite understanding, is a person of European descent. Now, again, some people think European, these people, these Edomites, as they would say, are destined for slavery, but the slavery only lasts for 1,000 years. Then after the 1,000 years, Yahushua zaps them out of existence. And then the other non-Israelite nations who were less offensive to God, like the Ishmaelites and the Hamites, as they would say, they will live in servitude after the Edomites have been gone after their 1,000 years of brutal slavery.
Hold on. Edomites come from Esau, and Esau's the brother of Jacob. They, I'm sure, would claim to be descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they believe that a black man was the brother of a white man?
Yeah, so they love to show stories where a black couple will have twins, and one is lighter and one is darker.
Okay.
And they'll say that that still happens today. And then they'll say, but what's the Bible say too? Let's go to Genesis 25:25. Read. Let's start in verse 24. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, this is the New King James Version. Indeed, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Now, if you slap a white person, Michael, they love to say it this way. If you slap a white person, what color will his face turn? It's going to turn red. If they're out in the sun too long, these unnatural creatures, what will they do? They'll turn red, right? So the white man's not really the white man. He's called himself that to hide his true identity. The white man is really the red man. He's red. And if you notice, a lot of white people are hairy too. You got these hairy white dudes, whereas our people have a smoother skin, and so they love to share memes of sunburnt hairy white guys and say, look at Esau. Look at Esau, right?
I don't know. I've seen some hairy black people, so I'm really confused here.
Well, so now some will say Vocab's reading it wrong. We interpret it somewhat different, but most do go to Genesis 25 as a justification to show that any scripture dealing with Edom, the kingdom of Idumea, that's the Greek way to say it, any scripture dealing with Esau as an individual, these all relate to people of white descent, of European descent, right? Who would be called so-called. That's why they like the term so-called, so-called white people. And so, yeah, they do think that, essentially one was black, one was white. Sometimes I make the joke and I say, so you're anti-Semitic. No, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm Semitic. Well, according to you, though, you think white people are Semitic because they're descended from Esau.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Sometimes I'll just mess around with that. But, fascinating scripture, real quick. Deuteronomy 23:7 says, abhor not the Edomite, for he's your brother. It literally says that, so they can't hate him. But they say, well, that was before Esau messed up real bad, and so that doesn't apply anymore. Some of them say that.
For some reason, I just thought of the fact that, Moses' wife was dark skinned according to scripture. So does it, and it speaks of her as if she's dark skinned, as if Moses and the Israelites weren't. I mean, it speaks of her kind of as different.
Well, I got one for you for that.
What do they say to that?
Well, we know Moses was a black man. You want me to prove it to you?
Yeah, let's hear
when
it.
he goes before the burning bush, when he puts his hand into his cloak, what color does it come out?
Right. But why?
Comes out white, showing you he's not a white man.
Okay, but I thought that had to do with him pulling out his hand and was infected as a leper.
Some of them associate white skin with leprosy.
Okay, but why would they focus on Moses' wife having that skin complexion if it was already natural to the Israelites?
Well, there's a few answers to that, and some of them get kind of complicated because some of the Hebrew Israelites have thought about stuff like this. Some say Moses did marry a woman of another nation. Okay. And they'll sometimes say, and she was a Hamite. Because remember, according to a Hebrew Israelite understanding, a Hamite is someone who is in Africa, sort of native to it, if you will. But the Israelites are passing through it. So you have Semitic and Hamitic peoples living side by side. So it wasn't our brothers and sisters who sold us into slavery. It was people of another nation. That's why they sold us to the so-called white man. And so if you understand that, now you understand why they sold who they sold. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew who the strangers were. They know who the newcomers were, those who didn't really fit in. So you may think they look alike, but really there's a difference in spirit. There's a difference in sort of the vibe. And we know whose is whose, right? And so they would say you can be dark skinned, even have a phenotype that's African, but that doesn't mean you're an Israelite. And so his wife might have been an example of that. Now, some say that's because you're allowed to marry women of another nation. And Moses is an example. So it doesn't matter what your wife is because that's irrelevant because it's whatever the father is. You can have whoever you want. Others say, no, that was because Moses violated the law. Or they say it was before the full rulings against that kind of thing had been unrolled, and so Moses wasn't violating anything yet, or there wasn't women. It was pragmatic. Wasn't enough Israelite women to go around. They'll say something like that, but they have different ways. But remember, they say that phenotypically, Hamites and Semites may look somewhat similar. You see what I'm saying? But they're not Hamites. They're Semites who passed through Africa on their way to New Egypt or Babylon, USA in the Western Hemisphere, according to Deuteronomy 28:68, by the way.
I don't. I'm trying to think of a nice way to put this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression that I'm getting is the kind of people that would be attracted to this are generally the people who are hurt by some kind of racist event in their life, maybe some kind of racist experience they've had with somebody who's white. And so they are attracted to this very pro-black racist group, in my opinion, from what it sounds like. They're attracted to it out of a reaction against some kind of bad experience that they had with white people. That's the impression that I'm getting. Do you think that that's accurate, or am I completely missing the mark? Because I don't know how anybody could be convinced of this intellectually. To me, it sounds like there's some kind of emotional need to have this preoccupation with skin color and things like that. What are your thoughts here?
Well, the ultimate issue, more so than facts on the ground, I do think is an issue of identity fulfillment. Sometimes what some people who study this, they call it identity completion, which basically means you know who you are type of thing. So that is an acute need really for every human, right? Mm-hmm. Who am I? Why am I here? These kinds of questions.
Sure.
But I think it's difficult to talk about this and, kind of not say the wrong thing, but I think people gotta, I can have empathy and sympathy and still fight bad ideas. And so some of the things I think that are important to consider is to say, when you look at what's happened during the transatlantic slave trade, which is it's a long period of time. This is an extended period of time that this activity is going on. You have people who are purposely split up from people who speak the same language as them. You have people whose families are purposely ripped apart. So, take mom from dad. All this is going on. And then now your name is John Smith, like the famous scene in Roots. What's your name? Toby. Mm-hmm. Until we no longer say Kunta Kinte. Mm-hmm. Your name's Toby, right? You're given this new name. Mm-hmm. Now here's how you dress. Here's your traditions. Here's this. Here's that. All this kinds of stuff. And the way you're looked at, when you look at certain documents in America's history, you have 3/5 compromise, for example. You have, Dred Scott decision. Actually, they're defined as property. These aren't even people. These are things to own. That's some American jurisprudence rulings were along those lines. This is property. So property doesn't have rights. You go down the list and you look at it. And then you have, we're going to call these folks this bad name. We're going to call them that bad name. We're going to call them this bad name. And then, it's like, all these different slurs, right? Which they would see, by the way, as the fulfillment of curses that belong to Israel when she disobeys. And you understand that. And, you look back and you hear these things and separate Jim Crow. You just go down this list and then someone says, hey, this book is about you. Jesus looked like you. You're chosen elect. And that person, let's just say it's 2021, your boss, that you don't like, that's not very cool. He's going to be your slave in the future. Something like that. And even if you don't have the slavery element. Now, some of these guys are obsessed with the slavery element. So I got to talk about that. But let's say Israel of God, who doesn't believe in this hardcore slavery element. There's still this idea of like, we have woken up to who we are. But here's what's fascinating. There are other religions that do this even without the level of acute hurt, as you might say. The Anglo-Israelites. Anglo-Israelism is about 100 years prior to Black Israelism and mainly began within Protestant churches within Britain. Originally, it was called British Israelism.
These are white people who think that they're Jews?
Yeah, they don't like the term Jew. Right. Because it's a long story how that goes, but they usually think they're
the Israelites of Scripture.
Yes, and you go, and it's fascinating. They use a lot of the same arguments, just essentially prior to the Hebrews, but they're in reverse. But a lot of times they were first, right?
And I'm confused why anybody would be attracted to this, other than what you're saying, that they find their identity. They have an identity crisis, and they're finding their identity in it. That's effectively what you're saying, right?
So this felt need of an identity completion, and one that is seen as essentially a preferable identity, right?
Okay.
That is a big thing. But you have white folks who did the same type of thing, right? So, so I point to the Anglo-Israelites, and they were big even with the Worldwide Church of God, Herbert Armstrong, and big into the Christian identity movement.
Are they still around?
Oh, yeah. The Christian identity movement has adopted a lot of Anglo-Israelism ideas. You can still find Anglo-Israelite writers. I have actually probably 20 of their books because I wanted to get I've done a couple shows on Anglo-Israelism because to look into it as well. So they're not growing anymore. They were mainly growing kind of when Britain was like in its heyday. Like especially in the maybe you say like the late 1800s, they started in the 1700s, but you see them they're almost like they grow with the British Empire type of thing. But in the early 20th century, they were really big. They were really big in the early 20th century.
Now, and Black Hebrew Israelism, is it growing significantly? Yeah.
So it's difficult to get real numbers on this stuff, right? Yeah. But let me try to refocus. But I can tell you, according to the most reliable data we have, which is kind of like the only reliable data we have, 1.5 million Black Americans identify as Hebrew Israelites because it's 4%. And if you do the numbers, depending on which way you flow, 4% equals about 1.5 million. Now, that doesn't mean there's 1.5 million people willing to go stand on a street corner and curse out children. That's not what that means.
Right.
But it means my identity is this. And a lot of them say, I'm staying in the Christian church because I'm still a Christian. Now I just know my ethnicity. But here's the problem. If that was all it was, it might be mistaken, most likely, but it's not the end of the world. For whatever reason, and I'm developing theories on this, and I challenge someone to show me that I'm wrong. I wish I was. Accepting the identity doctrine, which is usually the first person person accepts within Hebrew Israelism, acts as almost a magnet to heresy. So you start there, then you deny the Trinity. Then Jesus is not fully God. Then the cross is not an atonement. That you had the wrong understanding of the cross. Paul's writings are not biblical. Non-Israelites cannot be in the kingdom. You start to go and you're like, whoa, where did all this stuff come from? And then you're also willing to accept massive rewritings of established history. So I mentioned the Dark Ages, where a Black aristocracy, Israelite class is ruling, for example. That becomes a very real idea to you. These kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying all Hebrew Israelites accept all these ideas. You have to have a conversation with the Hebrews like you're talking to and ask them questions, because a lot of them disavow some of the more hateful and spiteful versions of their religion, but that doesn't mean their doctrine's right. So you still really need to ask these questions, because more and more people are saying, I want to be away from that, but I accept this identity doctrine. And you got to really ask what they mean by it, because it's starting to become, in some circles, almost, Michael, like dealing with Mormons, where you feel like you have a similar terminology, but you know they're defining it differently. And so it becomes a little difficult to kind of, it's like, let's nail this down, because there are real differences here. But it become difficult because you got to scale this wall, this language barrier, where you have the same terms, but they're radically defined in a different way, kind of thing. So there's that's kind of, I've done some videos on that too. I called it, what did I call it? The infiltration of Hebrew Israelism. I forget what I called it, but the idea is like now in churches, you're finding this more so in Protestant churches right now. I've met a couple of Hebrews like Muslims, and every now and then, according to some of my other buddies who do stuff on the East Coast, Roman Catholic Hebrew Israelites.
Wait. Wouldn't a Hebrew Israelite Muslim just be Nation of Islam? I mean, isn't that effectively what the Nation of Islam is?
Well, sort of. Nation of Islam actually does have a Black Israelism element to their teaching, but it's confused with other things that are sort of Arab-centric. They're the lost tribe of Shabazz, for example. But they also teach that they're the true nation of Israel. So it becomes a little confusing there. And that's not the main emphasis or element. But pointing to the Nation of Islam is interesting, because it helps you understand what are a lot of these reactionary religions doing in America as they react to white supremacy, is the way I'll put it. Partially, it's what's going on there. They're trying to say, you don't want to include me in your society. We have our own society, the Nation of Islam. If anyone knows about the Moors, they're the Moorish. They're their own nation. They consider, a lot of times that's why they're involved with the sovereign citizen movement. These Moors, the Hebrew Israelites. Hello, Israel. Israel's a nation. You go down the list and you look, and it's kind of a fascinating thing. Even the 5% breakaway group that broke off from Nation of Islam, the 5%ers, they're the nation of gods and earths.
I know about them from Wu-Tang. That's about as much as I know about
their official name, Michael, is the nation of the gods and earths.
So they think they're gods, right?
Yeah, but they don't mean God like in any kind of monotheistic way. They mean essentially as you have knowledge of self, you now have your own sphere of responsibility and sovereignty. So it's very ultimately relativistic and individualistic at that point. They mean God in a different way. Okay. It's almost quasi-Gnostic. When you start looking into it, when they explain it philosophically, it sounds very Gnostic in elements. Like we forgot this, that type of thing. But
now, when it comes to their message, I'm most curious about their understanding of the gospel. What exactly is their gospel message?
Yeah, you ask a Hebrew Israelite, what is the gospel? Man, that is that's something else. The hardcore types, Michael, literally make the gospel one of we're going to have the other nations in bondage. For example, Sakari will go to Luke 4, and they'll show where Jesus is speaking in the synagogue, and there he reads part of Isaiah 61. And then they'll say, so Jesus is saying this is the gospel. Now let's go to Isaiah 61 and read the entire thing. And they'll point to passages that have the submission motif in Isaiah 61, not a part that Jesus read, but a part of Isaiah 61, a part of the pericope there, right? And they'll say, look, this has bondage of other nations in it. So part of the gospel is other nations will be in bondage. But really, the gospel, the good news for the nations who say it's not, we're just going to be beating up on the other people. The groups who have it as something different, they basically have it as the good news is that you're an Israelite. And so that's why one of the first questions a Hebrew Israelite will tend to ask someone will be something like this: who's your father? What's your nationality? Right, that's their favorite question. Maybe if you're have encountered an evangelical, they might say, "Hey, are you saved?" They might say, "Why should God let you into heaven?" They might say something like that. They might say, "Are you right with Jesus?" Something, right? You have a personal relationship, right? Hebrew Israelites are like, "Who's your father? What's your nationality?" You see, so that's key to being able to embrace the good news. So the good news is you're an Israelite. Now you get to keep the law, and in the future you'll be reigning and ruling. That's the good news.
When I look at the book of Revelation, which it sounds like they're fond of quoting, at least Revelation 1, it speaks about people from every nation, tongue, and tribe praising God and being part of this covenant at the eschaton. What do they say about that?
Our people were scattered all over the four corners of all the earth. So
these are all just black people, but it speaks about different tongues, nations.
Well, remember the other Hebrew Israelites say that includes Native Americans and Hispanics. So they say it's not about being black; it's about your lineage.
So they think that basically white, Anglo-European, whatever people are excluded from this category that's mentioned in a category of people.
And Ishmaelites and Hamites and Elamites. Those are Indians from India.
But it seems when you look at, the book of Revelation, it's talking about every tongue and tribe and nation. It seems to be expansive and inclusive of every kind of person out there.
Yeah, that's because you preach the gospel of the white man, the so-called Jesus loves everybody doctrine, but we don't believe that. God doesn't love everybody, they might say. That's the soft.
Do they
Jesus
then
loves
believe
everybody.
The text is corrupt? Because I'm not preaching any gospel of a white man. I'm just looking at the text of the book of Revelation. It seems to be referring to every group of people out there.
Malachi says Jacob I have loved, Esau hated. So we know that Esau is the father of the white man. So you think God's going to have the white people whom he hates in heaven?
Yeah, it sure does seem that it hates in a very qualified sense Esau as an individual, although I know Romans kind of applies it to a group of people, but it sure does seem that that group of people is redeemed in the book of Revelation. So,
well, there are Hebrew Israelites who are not as militant in their interpretation, and they might say this is all nations finally come together with Judah leading. That'd be very important for them. Like Israel of God, I've mentioned several times. And Israel of God, if you're in Chicago, go to I believe it's called Riverdale. In Riverdale, they have a church there that seats 6,000 people. So that's Israel of God. That's their logo and their group, for example. So, I mean, they got a pretty large church there. For example, they might say that are all people finally worshiping God together as a family, as long as Judah can lead, because they believe that's what they call the proper protocol. So 4 or 5 days ago, I had a debate with a gentleman who's a Hebrew Israelite who believes Gentiles can be saved, but he thinks there needs to be a protocol in their understanding of their proper place and position. So some would maybe agree with you, right? But others say this is just Israelites who are scattered out and about. And some, if they want to appear more clever, may say, well, look right before that in Revelation chapter 7. If you look, it's got the 144,000. And what does it say? They're all of Israel. So these aren't Gentiles. These are Israelites. They might point to that in Revelation 7, specifically verses 5 through 8. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on what kind of interpretation you have for your eschatology, depends on where you go with this, right? My view, I believe is the biblical view, right, is not a dispensationalist view. It's that verse 4 is a key. Watch this, Revelation 7:4. And I heard the number of the sealed. Interesting. John is hearing a number. This kind of discordant sense element where he's hearing a number, I think helps show you, well, what's going on here. So he hears it. He hasn't seen it yet, right? He hears it, the number of the sealed. Now, Christians are described as those who are sealed by the Holy Spirit in the New Testament. Then it says from every tribe of the sons of Israel. Then you look through it, and everyone should have a red light that should flash. Dan is missing from this. This is like no list ever given in the Bible. So John is letting you know this isn't a regular list, right? Mm-hmm. If you realize that, plus going to the next verse, it says, after this I looked. So first he hears, now he turns around and he looks. So he's looking at what he just heard. What does he see? And behold, a great multitude that no one could number. Now, I thought they just were numbered. How's he turning and looking and seeing the group he just heard about, and they can't be numbered, but they were just numbered? That's because this is one of the numbers of completion, basically. This is saying the complete number of the elect of the church. Yeah. So they don't like this. You're into replacement theology is what they'll hit me with. But I think you can show from the text that's the case. A great multitude that no one could number. And then there's the next line you're talking about. From every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, stand before the throne, before the Lamb. So you say, well, wait, I thought it was only the Israelite tribes, but it's not. Not only that, but it's interesting. It says the sons of Israel. So if it's taken literal, Dan's not in there, and it's only males. And so there's problems with that. And so you look and you see it's the same group being described in two different ways. These are the elect, and they are from every nation, from every tribe, from every people. And if anyone's got their Old Testament in their mind, they're thinking Genesis, Abrahamic covenant, because it says from every nation. And then you remember multitude that no one could number. That's the promise that God gave to Abraham. You're going to have in your family so amount no one can number it, and it's going to bless every nation, every family of the earth, every tribe. Some interpretations, some translation. So this is a fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, is the new covenant people of God. Now, that's not a dispensational understanding, of course, of that, but I think that's the right answer, and that's where I would go. They don't like that. They'll say it's replacement theology, but my point is there's an answer to all these, and you keep on pointing to them. And look, you could, if you want to make it all 12 tribes, okay, but what about peoples? It says all peoples. Sure. Because you could say the tribes and language, and it also says every nation. So it clearly is out of, as if it's them, not just they've been pulled out of it. So they just try to make it either all Israelites, or some, like I said, will say this is everybody, but Judah's got to be leading. And that's why Judah's first on the list, they might say, because Judah is first on the list. Because these type of Israelites don't think Native Americans and Hispanics are Israelites. They think only black folks who are, and they identify primarily as Judah. And they believe you can be grafted in. You just got to know your place, like I said earlier, with the protocol. So they might have some different ways. That's why when you deal with the Hebrew Israelite, everybody, check it. You got to ask them questions and just find out where they're coming from. Don't assume. I'm just giving you some, like a beginning introduction. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. Just kind of wrapping it up here. what has been your experience as far as the best way to effectively help people out of this? I'm sure that's tough to answer because it sounds like there's really no unified view. So there's really not going to be a unified response. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, there's elements that are common to all Hebrew Israelism. We are the true Israelites. Those so-called Jews are frauds. So that's one thing. Another thing is you got to try to keep the law. That's another thing. Another is in some way Israel is better. And by the way, I'm part of Israel. So some will, in some way there's an ethnocentric element is my point by that. So there's the ethnocentric element, there's a Judaizing element, and there's the element that says, I am Israel and those Jews are not. Mm-hmm. Those are common things. And if you wanted to make a fifth one, it's almost universal across the board. It's a rejection of the Trinity. Almost across the board, a rejection of the Trinity.
Huh.
So
it seems like Paul's work would help offset almost all of that.
That's why you have different responses about the authority of Paul within Hebrew Israelism, just for that very reason, right?
Yeah.
So they have different. Some of them like to make Hebrews definitely written by Paul, because sometimes people have debates about that. That way they can also throw out Hebrews, because Hebrews talks about a change in the priesthood. It gets in all kinds of fascinating things. But then it says, well, if one thing's changed, it's not unalterable. Anyways, fascinating stuff in Hebrews for these discussions as well. But I would say focus on who is God and what is the gospel. Mm-hmm. So, these are kind of like the big items. So like if someone wants to debate birthdays, if you celebrate them, I'm just not that interested. I might have a little quick discussion about it, but I know it's not salvific, right? No one says you got to celebrate a birthday or, you don't got to observe the 4th of July, whatever you want to do. Hey, that's cool. So I'm not going to, and I believe there's some leeway about Saturday, Sunday observance, at least from my view. I'm processing over here. So those kinds of things. Okay. But when it comes to who is God and what is the gospel, now Roman Catholics and Protestants probably are going to have very similar conception of the who is God question, as long as you're not talking about a oneness or someone like that, right? But they would have some different emphasis on what is the gospel. And that's something I would also focus if I was going to talk to, say, a Roman Catholic. But I think even Roman Catholic will see this is not the gospel, because the gospel is not about slavery and servitude, right? But what is the gospel, What is the good news? What is the central message of the scripture? And really getting it back to making it Christ-centered, because they make it about Israel and they see themselves as Israel. So they really end up making the Bible about themselves. I am the center character of the Bible, basically. And I mean, that's really what a lot of these guys do. And so sometimes we call it narcissism. Now they like to borrow that term. Now some of them have started to use it to say the white man puts himself all over the Bible, but they stole that term from us when they use it, the narcissism term. But who is God? What is the gospel? Focus on that. And a healthy dose of church history will help, but it's difficult to find a Hebrew Israelite who's willing to have the discussion with you. But if they are, you can have some fascinating conversations about church history, I think, that are be important. And hey, people do come out, bro. They be coming out. They do be coming out. We get emails and messages all the time. Now, I would say Hebrew Israelism is growing more than it's shrinking. I'm not going to act like, there's not a real issue here, but they're losing a lot of people too. And the reasons are, people see the doctrine changing. Some of these groups will change on like and people are like, wait, there's no stability in that way. Some elements of scandal, elements of, I don't really think that's what the Bible's saying. People kind of wake up to how bad the interpretations of some of these passages are. Sometimes it's historical. And the trouble is, Michael, they don't always remain within the pages of the New Testament. A lot of Hebrew Israelites go atheist when they leave. Some of them get in weird stuff like something called comedic science. Some of them do that. You never know where they're going to end up. There's even a small, moderate, like as in theologically liberal contingent of Hebrew Israelism. It's small, but it exists. And so you don't know where they're going to go. That's why it's important to focus on God and the gospel. But in the meantime, I think it's going to grow. So we're going to have good answers for this. And the bad news is it fosters division amongst all people. So IUIC, if you're married to a Filipino woman and you get an IUIC, they'll give you about a year if you're lucky. And they say if you got to divorce your wife. They'll even say that if it's a fellow Israelite, if she doesn't get with the doctrine. So they say that for the family, IUIC, for example, that's the purple and gold guys. And yet they're constantly breaking up families due to ethnic or religious differences. And so that's division there right in the community that they claim to be helping, because IUIC claims they help and no Christian church does, right? But if you guys, I know you got a different kind of audience, you may find it fascinating to look up Hebrew Israelites, Roman Catholics, because just like they love talking about Protestant, they love talking about you guys too, and they say some pretty interesting stuff. So you guys might have.
I'd like to hear what. Maybe I'm gonna pull it up and do that as a comedy hour. I saw somebody in the chat asking me, "Am I gonna do a Black Hebrew Israelite edition of Comedy Hour?" What I do with Comedy Hours, I pull up videos by people who try to engage in theology, but it's extremely ridiculous content, and we just laugh at it. I might do that. I don't know.
I can send you some interesting stuff, man.
Yeah, I'd like to hear it. So especially if they're commenting on Catholics, I imagine it's pretty entertaining. So we'll definitely take a look at it if you can send that to me.
Yes, sir. By the way, a number of times I've been accused of being a Jesuit agent myself.
Oh, wow. Because I just had a comedy hour where they were accusing James White of being a Jesuit. Among some other individuals, and I thought that was the funniest thing I've ever seen. So I had to do a comedy hour on it. But accusing you of being a Jesuit, interesting. So what's the angle there? How did they say you're a Jesuit?
Some somehow tie in hand signs, so freeze frame, that kind of thing. Although I don't know how those connect exactly, and it's really just an assertion. But a lot of them claim that the Trinity doctrine at all, it's Roman Catholic, and so if you promote that, okay, you're wrong.
Okay,
and then if they find out I'm part Sicilian or Italian, they say, well, he literally is a Roman. He is a Roman. Okay. Look, he just told you. I don't know, but
so I guess I would be a Jesuit to them just because I'm Catholic.
I think so. I mean, these guys have a legend. Where supposedly, now this is not all of them, this is some of the older guys who still believe this, that was passed down, that the Pope visited them at their school and tried to convince them to change their teaching because he didn't want the truth to get out, and they denied him, and so the Pope actually went to Harlem. Now this is a small contingent of Hebrew Israelites who still pass this legend on, but they some of them actually believe it's true.
I guess they haven't got the memo that most Jesuits today aren't Catholics anyway. So,
yeah, they that's another thing they always attack me for is why am I not commenting on a scandal? Say there's a scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm like, why doesn't Vocab ever talk about this scandal or that scandal? So it's and I view it as a way. It's like, well, you're just trying to deflect. You don't want me to talk about your bad doctrine, so I got to talk. That kind of thing.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, man, hey, these are people, I mean,
sure.
There's a lot of I have humorous moments as well.
Sure.
But I hope and pray the best for these people. And even if you see me on the street, being like assertive or something, it's not because I'm angry or I hate somebody. It's because I'm trying to do everything I can that I believe is right and okay for a believer to do, to try to help pull people out of bad doctrine and point them to Jesus.
Sure.
Because, man, these folks want to claim the curses of Deuteronomy 28, but Galatians 3:13, it says if anyone, is in Christ, the curse has been lifted, because the curse of sin was on Jesus. And so we're free from the curse. That's a beautiful, powerful, awesome, liberating message. And they kind of have the opposite of that. It's a message of bondage.
That's it, because Galatians also notes if you go back to the law, you've severed yourself from Christ.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely concerning if they're trying to follow the law. That's very problematic.
It's a retrograde action. And when you really talk to them, they don't keep the law.
I imagine they don't.
Yeah, I haven't met any of these guys who spend the full 7 days during the Festival of Booths out there in the tent. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes say, so you believe in the Sabbath keeping? Oh, yeah. So your Sabbath rest is to be on a corner on 27th Avenue yelling at pedestrians? That's how you rest? Because if you notice, they're mainly out on Saturday, the One West type groups. How is that keeping the Sabbath, right?
It sounds like all you have to do is hit them with the law and show them that they're not keeping it. And
they'll say, well, where's your fringes at? You know, that's a big deal to them. So that's a common way to identify Hebrew Israelite is by the use of the fringes. They'll say, if you're not wearing fringes, you're not spiritual, because the Bible says the law is spiritual. So wearing your fringes is part of the law. So if you don't have them, it shows you're not spiritual. So a number of...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure you could, mention, I mean, have you always honored your father and mother? Have you ever blasphemed God? Have you ever stolen anything? I imagine you could walk them through that list, and
you're starting to sound like Kirk Cameron.
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's getting way of the master.
But you know what's interesting about what you just said?
Yeah,
the hardcore guys, like I mentioned, Sakari, the leader of Sakari has a mother who was Caucasian, right? And he has been on record saying that it could be okay basically to kill her and that she's going to go into slavery. And so we hit him with, yo, bro, honor your father and your mother. Like, it doesn't sound like it's honoring your mother to be like, hey, mom.
Yeah, when you get to that point, it sounds like that person could be even a danger to society. Wow, that's interesting.
Some of the groups are developing into a real scourge in the cities. Sakari, I think, is a scourge and a problem. They're not Al Qaeda. They're not ISIS. I'm not saying that. They're not the KKK. I'm not saying that. But that doesn't mean that there's not real problems developing within some of these groups, like a Sakari or Watchmen for Israel. Those are two of the groups that are problematic, because usually with these groups, if they have an element of violence, it's usually cast into the future, you know. But some of the groups are getting more like, hey, we can, there's wiggle room of what we can even do now, basically. And some of the groups, like in Arizona, encourage carrying firearms to camp. And so there's some videos of them pulling out weapons on people. I have a whole video where I put a Yosemite Sam on the cover, Yosemite Sam, because he's like blasted everybody, because they're like pulling guns on drunk people and stuff like that. And there could be some bad problems. There was a movie about this that came out, There Shall Be Tomorrow. What was it? It was about a year and a half ago. It's about apocalyptic, like Hebrew Israelite like group that wasn't a terrorist group, but got pinned with some terrorist activities. And some Hebrew Israelites saw that as like what the FBI is going to try to do to them, because there's something called Project Megiddo, where the FBI made a report about groups that were dangerous at the turn of the millennium because they had year 2000 prophecies. And a small section of that FBI report, Project Megiddo, was some of these Hebrew Israelite groups are believing stuff's going to happen in the year 2000, so we got to watch out, or they're going to do something crazy. Now, the year 2000 prophecy came and went. So to the Hebrew Israelites who held to Yahushua returning at the end of 1999, they've had to reinterpret what that meant. But there was no violence involved with that. But a lot of pointed that say we're on the FBI's radar.
By the way, let me grab this question just since it's a super chat. Thank you, by the way, Alan, for the super chat. Question for Vocab: is there a connection between the Black Hebrew Israelites and Black Lives Matter?
Most Hebrew Israelites dislike Black Lives Matter because they're very concerned about, even if they believe in polygamy, what they view as a healthy family unit that I think you may be able to describe as patriarchal. And they see BLM as antithetical to that. So a lot of them essentially see it as another tool to undermine the black family. Plus, with some of the other elements, I'll just be careful on how I'll say it just for the sake of whatever. Some of the other elements of the agenda that seem official to BLM, they view that as an affront to God's law and more evidence of a problem. And so, by and large, most Hebrew Israelites are not pro-BLM. And a lot of times, if you'll see maybe a BLM rally, you'll see some Hebrew Israelites there preaching to everybody as if, hey, you guys are all wrong. This isn't going to fix anything anyway. Come get under the ruling of the Most High. That's the only real solution for our people, not this BLM stuff. So I don't see those kinds of connections. Some people also bring up CRT. I don't see those kinds of connections for me. If someone wants to show that I'm wrong, they could, but they'd have to show that I'm wrong. So I say no, because I see a lot of antithesis between the ideologies, and with the case of the Hebrew Israelites, it's actually explicit. I don't know how aware BLM folks are aware of BHI folks, as it were. And so I don't think so. And they'll sometimes use elements of trendy stuff that they know is trending and jump on it, but not because they're believing in it, because they're just trying to push their message. So they might say some BLM-ish stuff or hashtag it, but it's not because they're really about that cause, right? So anyways.
Here's one from DJ Next. By the way, thank you for the super chat there. Are we ever going to see a Vocab and Michael Lofton song collab?
Song collab. Yeah, you make beats, right?
Yeah. So maybe I'll make something and see what you could put down on it. So.
Well, I'm a semi-retired rapper, but DJ Next.
Same here.
He used to be my DJ when I would go out and do little shows. Yeah. And we reconnected recently. Real cool brother. I mean, I owe him a lot of my sound equipment he hooked up. And so if he would DJ it, you drop the beat.
Yeah.
I'd be down to do it. Just know anything we do will be further evidence that I am an agent of Rome.
Right, yeah. Just by coming on here already, you've really sealed the deal as far as you being a Jesuit. So
yeah, definitely. I can handle it. I can handle it. I mean, I've been there's a petition at change.org started by the Hebrew Israelites that is against me because I am accused of leading a racist hate group cult. And it's ironic. I think it's got almost 4,000 signatures.
How ironic.
Yeah, right? How ironic, right? I'm even accused of being anti-Semitic.
Interesting, because you refute their case and they're Semites. So okay, yeah, I see.
Go to change.org and put Vocab Malone, and you'll find it. You can even if you want to sign it, go ahead, guys.
I'm gonna have to check that out. Vocab, I want to have you back on. This has been fascinating.
Hey, I'm down. There's other interesting stuff we could talk about. For example, Anglo-Israelism, it's interesting. And then other alternative urban spiritualities. Like I mentioned the Nation of Islam, I mentioned the Moors, I mentioned the Kemetes. There's like this landscape that a lot of people, that's kind of underground, but it's very relevant, especially on the internet and things like that. And sometimes I'll do basic introductions to some of that stuff as well. Or you can always go deeper into Hebrew Israelism. You could always invite a Hebrew Israelite on and moderate a debate.
That's what I was thinking about. So we'll see if we'll talk off the air and see if we can maybe put that together, because that's kind of what I was thinking. But I mean, we could do any of those topics that you mentioned there.
All right, brother.
But go ahead and put in a plug for anything that you want to make the viewers aware of.
Well, I'm youtube.com/Vocab Malone, but they like to hit me with strikes when I talk about Islam. And so right now I've been going live on Facebook, which is kind of lame, but it's also been kind of fun to try to be somewhere else and do something else. So my current stuff I got going on is at facebook.com/Vocab Malone. But usually I'm at YouTube, but you won't see me on there for maybe a couple months as far as putting anything new out. But I've got a grip of videos there, so there's a lot to find, including if you want to find my videos where I do express my disagreements with the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
They're on there as well.
Interested in hearing those as well. So
I have one talking about the priesthood. I have one talking about the Pope a bit,
right?
Things like that. Justification issues, of course.
Sure. I'd like to hear those. All right. Well, again, thanks for coming on. We'll do it again. Everybody stay tuned. We'll definitely have a part due. So, but once again, thank you for coming on, and everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Share this on your social media. Also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us. Till next time. God bless.